Good morning to those of you watching on YouTube. We will begin our daily devotional in just a few moments. Thank you. Good morning, fellow pilgrims and friends and neighbors. Thank you for joining this morning for our daily devotional. We have been studying Philippians chapter 3 this week, and today I want us to look at one particular part of one verse. That's the beginning of verse 10. Remember, this is Paul writing to the church in Philippi, perhaps his favorite congregation, and he's explaining to them about how important it is to have the mind of Christ. And he expresses his wishes very clearly here in verse 10. And I want to read the first 5 words of Philippians 3, verse 10. Paul writes, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ. Now, remember, he's been contrasting knowledge of Christ with knowledge of the law. And he has concluded that knowledge of the law is worthless in contrast to knowledge of Christ. And he has learned enough in his Christian experience to know that what he really wants is to know Christ, and that the law has not led to the righteousness of God. Remember that, in fact, for Paul, the law led to his being a persecutor of the church. So something that is in itself good, that is God's law, was turned into something bad. And it's the ability that we have to make good things into bad things. And Paul is saying that in knowing Christ, we are able to avoid this trap. We're able to make our focus on Christ rather than on ourselves. And he's, I think, making it fairly clear that all of us have this temptation to make our own righteousness our focus. We have a tendency to turn Christianity into a list of rules, of do's and don'ts, and we turn it into church attendance and other things that we have a tendency to turn good things into bad things. And Paul says, don't do this. And the way to avoid doing this is to have the mind of Christ, that is, to know Christ. And Paul says explicitly, this is what he wants to know. He wants to know Christ. Now, remember, too, that this knowledge of Christ is not information. Knowing the law, in knowing the law, there's a temptation to know all of the details of the law, all the information about what the law is. And Paul makes it clear that knowing Christ is not knowing information. In fact, this knowledge is action. It is worship. It is prayer. It is feeding the hungry, visiting the sick and imprisoned, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked. These are the things that make up what it means to know Christ. So knowing Christ is not information, it's action. Some of you may remember that I have shared before that in the several opportunities that I've had to teach in Christian colleges around Southern California, that I often end the class by telling students that it's extremely difficult to be a follower of Christ at a Christian college or university. And part of the reason for that is that you have so many people and so many resources telling you this is how to be a follower of Christ. This is what it means to know Christ. And so there's all this information about Christ and about following Christ. And it becomes very tempting to think that you found the right information rather than recognizing that following Christ and having the mind of Christ, knowing Christ, is action. It's about the things that I've mentioned: worship, prayer, service to others, the things that Christ taught. And of course, this is the same for those of us who are frequent church attenders, who are trying to be good followers of Christ. This is one of our greatest temptations, to turn that something good into something bad. And in order to avoid that, in order to have the mind of Christ, our focus needs to be on this life of commitment to Christ, this life in which we try to be like Christ, moving from a position of strength to a position of weakness, giving of ourselves to others. Let's close with this word of prayer. Eternal God, most real when most invisible, most near when we think thee far away, most clearly conceived when we acknowledge thee to be incomprehensible. Speak to us not only from the past, but from the living present, not only from the awful silences, but in every tumultuous thought, not only from the clouds that veil thy heavenly throne, but from thine image graven on the heart of every human being. While our thoughts of thee grow wider, may we remember how vaster still thou art. And may we seek to grow more sensible of thy presence and to reflect thee more purely in our lives. Help us, O King of ages, in these changing times and these troubled days. Lose not care of us when we lose sight of thee. Still hold us fast when faith is feeble and knowledge is confused. If our thoughts of thee should grow doubtful and thine image within us be dimmed, may we unconsciously fulfill thy will. Help us to remember that it is not to the one that thinks, but to the one that does, that thy will is known. Help us to believe that thou abidest beyond all change and art always better than our highest hopes, greater than our noblest thoughts. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me this morning from Pilgrim Congregational Church. I'm Patrick Horn. Have a great day. Goodbye.